When I returned from the war, my family exclaimed, "You survived!" I placed my military hat on the counter, confused. Yes, I've been due to come home for months. My mom stumbled back and grabbed the doorframe. My dad held my sister's hand while her face went ghost white. I locked eyes with each of them, and that's when I saw it. Disappointment. Clear as day. They'd always seen me as the family regret, but I was hoping deployment would change that. I was just about to surprise them with my promotion of $300,000 when my dad butted in. "Son, maybe you should extend your deployment." Suddenly, all of my family's heads turned up in anticipation of my response. I can't. I was exposed to the burn pit, and it gave me a rare form of cancer. I only have 8 months left to live. As soon as the lie left my lips, I watched their reaction like a hawk. For a split second, I caught the sight of a smirk on every single one of their faces. "That's so sad," my sister blurted out, burying her face in her hands. "They better provide good death benefits at least," my mom said, rubbing my arm. "I think they give $400K to grieving families." That night, I pretended to sleep on the couch. From the kitchen, Mom, Dad, Cecilia, and her boyfriend Pender were talking. "His insurance pays out $400,000 when he goes," Mom said. "Pender, you can finally start your business," Cecilia added. "Cecilia's wedding will be fully funded," Pender responded. I smiled silently. You see, I'd heard dozens of horror stories in the military, and I knew that the best revenge was feeding into their delusions and letting them destroy themselves. Over the next few days, I played my part perfectly. I'd stumble into walls, I'd cough blood into tissues. When Pender mentioned wanting a new truck, I made sure to wheeze. I wish I could help, but that's when Dad's eyes lit up. "Actually, son, could you sign something for us?" "Just family paperwork." I pretended my hands were too weak to read it properly, but it was a $100,000 loan against my life insurance policy. "Whatever helps the family, Dad." What they didn't realize was they'd just committed a federal crime. The real game began when Pender quit his job. He walked in carrying a cardboard box from his office. "Why work when we're rich in 5 months?" he announced, not knowing I was home. I listened as he replayed the phone call with his boss. "You lazy sack of shit. You didn't even bother checking my CV, and I faked half my degree and certifications." "Pender!" Cecilia fake scolded, giggling like a maniac. A few nights later at dinner, I decided to twist the knife. "You know," I said casually, pushing food around my plate, "the doctor said something strange today. My white blood cell count is improving. He said the cancer might not be as aggressive as—" Cecilia's fork clattered onto her plate. "What?" She cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "I mean, doctors can be wrong. Let's not get our hopes up." "Yeah," Pender added quickly. "False hope is cruel. We should prepare for the worst." I nodded slowly, but in the back of my mind I thought about how I'd already spent my $300,000 bonus. The Mercedes AMG in storage. The downtown penthouse already furnished. Every day they thought I was at treatment. I was living my actual life. It almost made me feel guilty, until it was time for the funeral planning. Mom pulled out a literal binder. "We've picked your casket," she said, showing me the cheapest option. "And Cecilia's giving your eulogy." "We told the funeral home payment in full comes from life insurance," Dad explained. He'd also cashed out his entire 401k with a 40% penalty, losing the $80,000 he'd saved for 30 years. "Smart thinking," I wheezed. Cecilia had dropped out of college in her final semester, forfeiting her degree and $60,000 in tuition. My mom had broken the apartment lease, owing $15,000 in penalties, and told her landlord to sue her because I'll be rich soon. That night I heard them on a conference call with a voice I didn't recognize. "We need another $100,000, Dad was saying. "The insurance pays out in 2 months maximum." "You understand what happens if you don't pay?" The accent was thick, and there was casino music in the background. "We'll have your money," Pender promised. "His organs are failing." My life had been reduced to collateral. The next morning, Mom handed me a coffee with shaking hands. It tasted bitter. Wrong. I pretended to drink it while she watched, then poured it out later. The residue at the bottom looked grainy. They were trying to speed things up. The next morning, I scheduled a family meeting for Sunday, saying the doctors wanted to discuss hospice options. They practically celebrated. They had no idea the funeral they'd planned wasn't mine. It was theirs. I lay on that couch for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying every word from the kitchen. The way Mom calculated the insurance payout like she was shopping for groceries. How Pender mapped out his business plans using my death as startup capital. Cecilia giggling about wedding funds while I supposedly rotted from cancer in the next room. When morning light started filtering through the curtains, I knew I couldn't just pack my bags and disappear. They'd committed crimes, real federal offenses, and if I walked away, they'd just find another mark or keep spiraling into worse decisions. But I also knew I needed to be smart about this, not emotional. Tristan always said the difference between a good soldier and a dead one was knowing when to call for backup. I grabbed my phone and stepped outside to the back porch, dialing his number before I could talk myself out of it. He picked up on the second ring, his voice rough with sleep but instantly alert when I said I needed help. I told him everything in a rush, the fake cancer diagnosis, the insurance fraud, the loan against my policy, the way they celebrated my impending death. He didn't interrupt once, just listened to the whole story, and when I finished, there was a long silence before he spoke. "Document everything," he said. "Every conversation, every text, every piece of paper they make you sign. Stay calm. Don't let them see you're onto them, and for God's sake, don't do anything that makes you as bad as they are." His voice had that same steady quality from overseas, the tone that kept me grounded during the worst firefights. I spent the rest of the morning at the library 2 towns over, setting up a secure cloud storage account under an email they didn't know about. I uploaded every recording I'd made so far, the audio from the kitchen where they divided up my death benefits, the video of Pender bragging about his fake credentials, screenshots of text messages where Cecilia talked about wedding venues. I created folders for each family member and added timestamps and context notes for everything, making sure a prosecutor could follow the timeline without any gaps. The librarian gave me a weird look when I asked about their privacy policy for public computers, but I just smiled and said I was working on a research project. By the time I got back to the house around 1 in the afternoon, I felt like I had some control back, like I wasn't just a victim waiting for them to finish me off. Dad was waiting in the kitchen with more paperwork spread across the table, his reading glasses perched on his nose like he was doing something legitimate instead of plotting. He waved me over with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and explained he needed me to sign a medical power of attorney, just standard stuff for someone in my condition. I pulled out my phone like I was checking messages but actually started recording video, angling it so the camera caught both of us in the documents. My hands shook a little as I picked up the pen, but I made it look like weakness from my fake illness instead of rage. Dad explained the form would let them make healthcare decisions if I couldn't communicate near the end, his voice so caring and paternal that I almost believed he meant it. I watched his face as I signed, saw the little flash of satisfaction he tried to hide, the way his shoulders relaxed once my signature was on the page. He patted my arm and said he was proud of how brave I was being, then carefully filed the document in a folder labeled with my name. That evening I heard voices from the garage and moved closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. Pender was on the phone with someone, his voice loud and boastful in that way drunk people get when they think they're being clever. He was talking about the new truck he'd already picked out, laughing about how he told his boss where to shove his job because his girlfriend's brother was about to make them all rich. The worst part was what came next, when he said the dumb bastard didn't even know they'd been planning this for months, that they'd talked about it before I even came home from deployment. My stomach turned as I realized this wasn't opportunistic greed, it was premeditated. They'd been hoping I'd die overseas, and when I survived, they just adjusted their timeline. I backed away from the door before he could hear me and went to my room, sitting on the bed and trying to process what I'd just learned. The next morning, I decided to test them, to see how committed they were to this timeline of my death. At breakfast, I mentioned casually that my doctor said something weird yesterday, that my latest blood work showed improvement in my white blood cell count. I watched Mom's coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips, saw the flash of panic cross her face before she forced it into concern. She set the cup down carefully and said, "Doctors could be wrong. That false hope was the cruelest thing, and I shouldn't get my expectations up." Cecilia jumped in quickly, agreeing that I should prepare for the worst instead of counting on some miracle that probably wouldn't happen. Their eagerness to keep me dying was so obvious it would have been funny if it wasn't terrifying. Later that afternoon, I found Mom's funeral planning binder sitting open on the kitchen table, like she'd been reviewing it and got distracted. I flipped through the pages and felt my jaw clench with each new detail. She'd picked the absolute cheapest casket option, the kind that's basically particle board with a thin veneer. The funeral home she'd chosen advertised budget packages for families on fixed incomes. There was a handwritten note in her careful script about how the life insurance would pay the funeral home directly, so they wouldn't have to front any money themselves. She'd even calculated how much they'd have left over after funeral costs, with neat columns showing the split between her, Dad, and Cecilia. That night, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth when I heard voices in the living room, someone on speakerphone with an accent I couldn't quite place. I cracked the door open and heard Dad talking about needing more time, about how the insurance would pay out in 2 months maximum. The voice on the phone was thick and rough, maybe Eastern European, asking when they'd have the rest of the payment. There was casino noise in the background, slot machines and crowd sounds, and the voice said something about understanding what happens if they don't pay. Dad promised they'd have the money, his voice shaking in a way I'd never heard before. Pender chimed in saying my organs were failing, that it wouldn't be much longer, and I realized Dad had borrowed from someone way more dangerous than a bank. The next morning, Mom did something she'd never done in the entire time I'd been home. She made me coffee and brought it to me on the couch. She hovered while I took the first sip, watching my face with an intensity that set off every alarm bell in my head. The coffee tasted wrong, bitter in a way that had nothing to do with how it was brewed. I pretended to drink it while she stood there, making small talk about the weather and asking how I slept. The second she left the room, I got up and poured the whole cup down the kitchen sink, rinsing it carefully. At the bottom of the cup was a grainy residue that definitely wasn't coffee grounds, something that had only partially dissolved. I took a photo of it with my phone, then used a plastic bag to collect some of the residue before washing the cup. My hands were shaking as I sealed the bag and hid it in my room. I grabbed my phone and texted Tristan, my fingers fumbling on the screen. I told him I thought they were trying to speed things up, that Mom had put something in my coffee that morning. His response came back in seconds, all caps telling me to get out of that house right now and call the cops. But I texted back that I needed to see this through, needed them to incriminate themselves completely, so there was no way they could talk their way out of it when this all came crashing down. That afternoon, I drove to the public library 3 towns over where nobody would recognize me. I found a quiet corner in the legal reference section and started pulling books on criminal law. The insurance fraud statutes were clear as glass. What Dad did by taking out that loan against my policy using forged access to my account was a federal crime carrying 5 to 10 years. The attempted poisoning fell under aggravated assault in our state, prosecutable even if the victim didn't actually ingest the full dose. What really caught my attention was the conspiracy section. Everyone who knew about the plan and participated in any way could be charged as co-conspirators, which meant Mom, Dad, Cecilia, and Pender were all potentially facing serious time. I took photos of the relevant pages with my phone and made notes about which statutes applied to which actions. By the time I left the library, I had a clear picture of just how much trouble they'd created for themselves. The next morning, I drove to a hardware store 2 towns in the opposite direction. I bought 3 small recording devices that looked like normal everyday objects. One was a pen that actually wrote but had a microphone and memory card inside. Another was a phone charger that plugged into the wall and recorded everything within 15 feet. The third was a small desk clock that looked cheap, but captured both audio and video. The guy at the checkout didn't ask any questions, just rang up my purchases and wished me a good day. Back at the house, I waited until everyone was out. Dad had gone to meet with someone about money, Mom was at her sister's place, and Cecilia and Pender were apartment hunting even though they had no income. I set up the pen on the kitchen counter where they always gathered to talk. The phone charger went into an outlet in the living room behind the couch. The clock I placed on the dining room shelf where it had a clear view of the table. I tested each one with my phone app to make sure the coverage overlapped, and I wasn't leaving any blind spots in the main areas where they plotted. When I got back from testing the devices, I called a hospice organization I found online. A woman with a kind voice answered, and I explained that I'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer and wanted to discuss end-of-life planning with my family present. She connected me with a social worker named Marguerite, who asked some basic questions about my diagnosis and timeline. I told her the doctors said I had maybe 2 months left and my family was struggling with the reality of it. She said she understood, and these conversations were never easy, but having a neutral professional present often helped families communicate better. We scheduled her to come to the house Sunday at 2 in the afternoon. I made sure to mention I wanted my whole family there so we could all hear the same information and make decisions together. She said that was actually ideal and she'd bring intake forms and information packets. After I hung up, I felt the first real sense of control I'd had since this whole thing started. Sunday was going to be the day everything came out, and now I'd have a credible witness there when it happened. That night, alone in my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at my hands. They looked like my hands, but I didn't quite recognize what they'd been doing lately. Setting traps, gathering evidence, manipulating my own family even if they deserved it. I wondered if I was becoming just like them, calculating and cold and willing to hurt people to get what I wanted. The thought made my stomach turn. But then I remembered their faces when I told them I was dying. Those smirks that flashed for just a second before they covered them with fake sadness. I remembered Mom's voice talking about death benefits like she was discussing a lottery win. I remembered Dad borrowing money from criminals using my life as collateral. The difference was clear when I really looked at it. They were trying to profit from my death. I was trying to stop people who wanted me dead. That wasn't the same thing at all. I waited until mid-morning when the house was busy with everyone moving around to make my anonymous call. I used a burner phone I'd picked up at a convenience store and dialed the insurance company's fraud hotline. A man answered, and I told him I had information about a potentially fraudulent claim on a life insurance policy. I gave him my policy number and suggested he might want to audit the account for irregularities. I mentioned that someone had taken out a loan against the policy, and there might be misrepresentation on the application about the insured person's medical condition. He started asking for my name and contact information, but I told him I was just a concerned party who thought they should look into it. Then I hung up before he could press me further. It wasn't much, but it would get them looking at Dad's paperwork, and once they started digging, they'd find all the forged documents and false statements. The next day, I walked into the police station and asked the officer at the front desk if I could speak with a detective about a potential crime. She made a phone call, and 10 minutes later, a man in his 40s came out to the lobby. He introduced himself as Detective Morris and led me back to a small interview room with a table and 4 chairs. I sat down and told him everything. The fake cancer diagnosis, my family's reaction, the insurance fraud, the loan from dangerous people, and the coffee Mom gave me that tasted wrong. I showed him the photos of the grainy residue and explained I'd saved a sample in a sealed container. He listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and studied me for a long moment. Then he said he could help, but I'd need to understand this wasn't going to be simple. I'd need to wear a wire and document everything in real time. The case would be stronger if we caught them in the act of planning or attempting something, rather than just relying on past evidence. I told him I was ready to do whatever it took. That evening, I rented a storage unit across town under a fake name I'd used for my penthouse lease. I loaded my car with everything that mattered. The title to my Mercedes that was sitting in a different storage facility. My military medals in their presentation case. My actual medical records from the base hospital showing I was healthy with no cancer diagnosis. My discharge papers and promotion documentation. The folder with my real bank statements showing the $300,000 bonus. I drove it all to the storage unit and locked it away where my family couldn't get to it if things went bad. On the drive back, I memorized 3 different routes away from the house in case I needed to leave in a hurry. I programmed Detective Morris's direct number into my phone under a fake name. I mapped out where the nearest police station was and how long it would take to get there from different locations. I wasn't taking any chances that they might try something before Sunday. The next morning, the hospice intake call happened right on schedule. I gathered everyone in the living room and put Marguerite on speakerphone. She introduced herself and explained she'd be coming by Sunday to do a full assessment and discuss care options. She asked some questions about my current condition and symptoms. Mom's voice broke at exactly the right moment when she described how hard it was watching me decline. Cecilia talked about wanting to cherish our remaining time together and make sure I was comfortable. Dad asked practical questions about pain management that made him sound like a caring father instead of someone counting down days until a payout. Pender even chimed in about how the whole family was committed to supporting me through this difficult time. They performed grief so perfectly, it would have fooled anyone who didn't know the truth. Marguerite said she was impressed by how involved and supportive they all were, that many families struggled to face these conversations. After the call ended, they all looked relieved, like they'd passed some kind of test. I waited until everyone dispersed to different parts of the house before I made my move. I'd printed out forms from a legal template website the night before, official-looking documents with the header, Accelerated Death Benefit Application, across the top. These were real forms that some insurance companies use to let terminally ill people access part of their death benefit early. I filled in most of the fields but left the signature line blank. Then I put everything in a folder and left it on the dining room table where someone would definitely find it. I positioned one of my hidden cameras to capture the table from the perfect angle. If anyone tried to forge my signature, I'd have it on video. The bait was set. That afternoon, Mom came to me with a concerned expression and said she wanted to help organize my medications since I had so many bottles, and it must be confusing to keep track of everything. I watched her hands carefully as she lined up all the pill bottles on the kitchen counter. She sorted them by type and time of day, making neat little rows and explaining her system. When she stepped away to get a notepad, I quickly pulled out my phone and photographed everything. The bottle labels, the dosages, the pill counts. I zoomed in on each bottle to get clear images of exactly how many pills were inside. If any went missing or got swapped with something else, I'd have proof of what they were supposed to be. Mom came back and finished her organizing, writing out a schedule for when I should take each medication. She seemed genuinely pleased with herself, like she was doing something helpful. I thanked her and told her it really did make things easier. She squeezed my shoulder and said that's what family does. They take care of each other. The words would have been touching if I didn't know what she'd already tried to put in my coffee. 2 days later, I was in the kitchen making breakfast when I heard Dad get the mail. He came back inside holding a thick envelope with the insurance company logo on it. I watched from around the corner as he opened it and started reading. His face went from confused to pale to red in about 10 seconds. He called for Mom and Cecilia, and they gathered around the dining table while I stayed back where they couldn't see me. Dad read the letter out loud and his voice was shaking. The insurance company was flagging the policy for audit. All benefit access was frozen pending investigation. They had questions about the loan application and needed to verify medical information. The explosion was instant and beautiful. Dad started yelling about timing and how this was going to ruin everything. Mom was crying and saying they'd already spent money they didn't have. Cecilia turned on Pender and blamed him for pushing Dad to take out the loan so fast. Pender fired back that it was her idea to speed things up in the first place. They went back and forth for 20 minutes, each one blaming someone else, while I stood there recording every word on my phone. When they finally calmed down enough to think straight, Dad said he'd call the insurance company and straighten it out. Mom said they needed to be careful what they said, because audits meant they were looking for fraud. That night at dinner, everyone was tense and quiet. Dad kept checking his phone like he was waiting for something important. We were halfway through the meal when his phone rang. He looked at the number and his whole body went stiff. He put it on speaker and set it on the table. I was in the living room, but I could hear everything perfectly. The voice on the other end had a thick accent, and there was casino noise in the background. The man asked where his money was. Dad tried to explain about the insurance audit and how it was just a delay. The voice cut him off and said he wanted $50,000 by next week. Dad stammered something about needing more time. The man's voice got cold and said if he didn't have the money by next Friday, they would start taking payment in other ways. Dad promised the insurance money was coming soon, just a small delay. Everything would be fine. The man hung up without saying goodbye. I watched Dad's hands shake as he picked up his phone. Mom asked who that was and Dad just shook his head. The next morning I came downstairs and found everyone at the breakfast table. I sat down and mentioned casually that I had a doctor appointment yesterday. They all looked up at me. I said my oncologist mentioned something interesting about a new clinical trial. The trial was for my type of cancer, and it might extend my timeline by 6 months or more. Maybe even a year if it worked really well. I watched their faces carefully. Mom was the first to speak. She said clinical trials were risky and often gave false hope. Dad agreed and said experimental treatment might make my remaining time miserable instead of peaceful. Cecilia jumped in saying I should focus on quality of life, not quantity. Pender added that trials were just guinea pig experiments and most of them failed anyway. They all talked over each other trying to convince me not to do it. I let them go on for a few minutes before I said I'd think about it. The relief on their faces was obvious. After breakfast, I grabbed the sealed container with the coffee residue and drove across town to a medical lab. I explained to the technician that I suspected someone was drugging me and needed the residue tested. She looked concerned and asked if I was in immediate danger. I told her I was safe for now, but needed proof of what was in the coffee. She said they could run a full toxicology screen. I mentioned that Detective Morris had sent over a chain of custody form. She pulled it up on her computer and nodded. The form would make sure the results could be used as evidence if this went to court. She labeled the container and gave me a receipt. She said results would take 3 to 5 business days. That afternoon my phone rang and it was Tristan. He didn't waste time with small talk. He said I needed to hire a lawyer before this went any further. I started to argue, but he cut me off. He said even though I was the victim here, my own lying about being sick could create legal problems. I might need someone protecting my interests too. I told him I'd think about it, but hiring a lawyer now might tip off the family that something was wrong. He said I was being stupid and stubborn. We argued for a few more minutes before he made me promise to at least look up some names. I agreed just to get him off my back. That evening, Mom found me in my room and said she wanted to help me keep track of my medications. She said it must be confusing with so many different pills and schedules. I told her that would be really helpful. We went to the kitchen and she started going through all the bottles. She organized them by time of day and wrote out a detailed schedule. Before she touched anything, I pulled out my phone and took pictures of every single bottle. I zoomed in on the labels and made sure I could see the pill counts clearly. When Mom stepped away to get a pen, I took more pictures. After she finished organizing everything, I thanked her and said it really did make things easier. When she left the room, I took another complete set of pictures. I checked each bottle against images online to make sure the pills inside matched what the labels said. Everything looked normal so far, but I wasn't taking any chances. The next day, Detective Morris called while I was out getting groceries. He said the insurance investigator Evelyn had finished reviewing Dad's loan application. She confirmed that Dad had lied about my medical condition and forged access to my online insurance portal. The application had false information about my prognosis and treatment timeline. It was enough for fraud charges, but they wanted more evidence of the broader conspiracy before moving forward. The detective said they were building a case that would stick to everyone involved, not just Dad. He asked if I'd noticed anything else suspicious. I told him about the loan shark call and how scared Dad looked. He said that was good information and to keep documenting everything. He explained they'd logged the coffee sample and were tracking whether anyone in my family had purchased sedatives or other substances. He wanted to know if I'd seen anyone going to pharmacies or making suspicious purchases. I realized I hadn't been paying close enough attention to their daily movements. I'd been so focused on recording their conversations that I missed the physical evidence trail. He told me to start watching where they went and what they bought. 2 days before Sunday, a black car pulled up outside our house. A man in an expensive suit got out and walked toward the door. Dad was in the living room, and when he looked out the window, his face went completely white. He told us all to stay inside and went out to the porch. I moved to a window where I could see without being obvious. The man was talking, and Dad was nodding and pulling out his wallet. Dad handed over some cash, but based on the man's angry hand gestures, it wasn't enough. The conversation got heated, and the man poked Dad in the chest a few times. After the man left, Dad stood on the porch for a long time just staring at nothing. When he came back inside, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. His hands were shaking and there was sweat on his forehead even though it wasn't hot outside. That afternoon, I decided to push things further. I was in the kitchen getting water when I let my knees buckle and fell to the floor. I made sure to gasp like I couldn't breathe properly. I kept my eyes half closed so I could see their reactions. The family rushed over and surrounded me. Through my eyelashes, I watched their faces. Pender muttered something under his breath that sounded like finally. Cecilia hissed at him to shut up. Mom's voice was cold and calculating when she asked if they should call for help or just wait and see. Dad said to give it a minute and see if I came around on my own. They stood there watching me struggle to breathe for what felt like forever. Finally, Mom told Cecilia to get me some water. I let my breathing slowly return to normal and opened my eyes fully. They all rushed to help me up and asked what happened. I said I just felt dizzy all of a sudden. Mom said it was probably the cancer progressing and I should rest more. They helped me to the couch and brought me water and pillows. The whole time they were playing concerned family, I was thinking about what I'd just heard them say when they thought I was unconscious. The next morning, my phone rang early, and I saw Detective Morris's number on the screen. I stepped outside to the back porch where nobody could hear me. He got straight to the point about the coffee sample I'd given him. The lab found crushed sleeping pills in the residue, enough to cause serious problems if I'd been taking other medications, or if my body was actually weak from illness like they thought. He said it was solid evidence of attempted poisoning, and combined with the insurance fraud, they were building a strong case against the whole family. But he needed Sunday's meeting to happen so they could catch everyone together with witnesses present who could testify about what they saw and heard. I told him I understood and asked what I should do until then. He said to act normal, keep documenting anything suspicious, and stay safe. By midday, I got a call from Evelyn at the insurance company. She'd been digging through their systems and found the access logs for my policy portal. Dad's laptop showed up in the records with timestamps proving he logged in pretending to be me. He'd submitted the loan application himself and attached forged medical papers that made my condition sound worse than I'd even claimed it was. She said the fraud was clear as day, and she was working with Detective Morris to have everything ready for Sunday's confrontation. I thanked her and hung up feeling this weird mix of victory and sadness that my own father had done this. Later that afternoon, I was checking my phone when I walked past the family computer in the den. Cecilia had left herself logged in, and I could see her text messages right there on the screen. My stomach dropped as I read through a conversation with Pender from 2 days ago. She was asking about ways to shorten the wait and whether his cousin, who works as a nurse, could get access to something stronger than sleeping pills. Pender had responded asking what she meant by stronger, and Cecilia wrote back that she meant something that would look natural, like a heart attack or stroke. I felt sick reading my own sister actively plotting to kill me. I grabbed my phone and took screenshots of everything, then sent them straight to Detective Morris with shaking hands. He texted back within minutes saying this was exactly the kind of evidence they needed and to be extra careful around the family. I spent the rest of the afternoon working with Detective Morris on setting up a trap for Saturday. We arranged for a delivery company to bring an official-looking envelope addressed to me containing a fake accelerated benefit payout check. The check looked real enough to fool someone who wasn't looking too close, and it required my signature to deposit. Detective Morris said we were betting that someone would try to forge my signature, and we'd have it on camera when they did. I positioned my phone in the living room bookshelf with the camera aimed at the front door and mail table, making sure the angle would catch everything. Friday morning, I called the hospice organization and asked to speak with Marguerite. I confirmed she'd be arriving Sunday at 2 in the afternoon for the consultation. She asked if there was anything specific she should know beforehand, and I explained there was some family tension around my illness. I said I wanted a neutral professional present to help guide difficult conversations about end-of-life planning. It was true enough that she didn't question it, and she told me she'd worked with plenty of complicated family situations before. She sounded kind and professional, and I almost felt bad about what she was walking into. Saturday morning arrived, and I made a big show of being tired and needing to nap in my room. I pulled up the camera feed on my phone and watched the living room from under my blankets. Right on schedule, the delivery person knocked and left the envelope on the front porch. I watched Pender answer the door and bring the envelope inside. He looked at the return address and his eyes got wide. He called for Cecilia, and they opened it together right there at the mail table. I watched Pender read the fake check and saw his face light up with greed. He grabbed a pen and some scratch paper from the drawer and started practicing my signature over and over. After about 10 tries, he carefully signed the endorsement line on the back of the check. The whole thing was caught in perfect high-definition video. I saved the file immediately and sent a copy to Detective Morris. He responded with a thumbs up and told me that was textbook forgery. That afternoon, Dad found me in the kitchen and said he needed to talk. He sat me down at the table with another form and explained it was a DNR order. He said it would tell doctors not to try to bring me back if my heart stopped, that it would prevent me from suffering through painful procedures that probably wouldn't work anyway. His voice was so gentle and caring that if I didn't know better, I might have believed he actually gave a damn about my comfort. I signed the form, but it wasn't the one he thought it was. I'd prepared my own version that looked identical, but included hidden language that logged any changes or alterations to the document. I watched Dad's shoulders relax once my signature was on the page, and he patted my hand like a loving father. That evening, I was in the bathroom when I heard Dad on the phone in the hallway. He was talking to someone about finalizing a payment arrangement and asking them to come by Sunday afternoon around 2:30. My stomach dropped hard as I realized what this meant. Dad had scheduled a meeting with the loan shark at the exact same time as the hospice consultation. These were dangerous people who'd already threatened him, and now they'd be showing up right when the police were planning to move in. I waited until Dad went to bed, then called Tristan in a panic. I told him I was thinking about just posting everything online and exposing the whole situation publicly instead of waiting for Sunday. He listened to me freak out for a few minutes, then talked me down in that calm way he has. He pointed out that going public now would warn the family and give them time to destroy evidence. He said I needed to trust the legal process, even though it was scary, and even though it felt like things were spinning out of control. He reminded me that Detective Morris knew what he was doing and had handled situations way more complicated than this. By the time we hung up, I felt steadier, but I still barely slept that night. Sunday morning, I got up early and drove to a notary office across town. I brought documents I'd prepared for a proper living will with an independent executor who wasn't family. The notary witnessed my signature and asked questions to make sure I understood what I was signing. I explained that previous documents I'd signed were done under pressure, and I wanted to make sure my actual wishes were legally clear. She notarized everything and gave me certified copies. I drove straight to my storage unit and locked the originals in my safe, then sent scanned copies to Detective Morris, creating a paper trail that would protect me no matter what happened later today. Back at the house, I found myself alone in the living room, staring at the bookshelf where Mom kept the family photo albums. I pulled down the oldest one and opened it on the coffee table. Birthday parties from when I was 7 with a homemade cake and paper decorations. Christmas mornings with all of us in matching pajamas that Mom insisted we wear for photos. A trip to the beach where Dad taught me to build sandcastles, and Cecilia buried my feet in the sand while laughing. I turned the pages slowly and studied each picture, looking for signs of what they would become. But the smiles looked real. The hugs looked genuine. Dad's hand on my shoulder at my high school graduation seemed proud, not disappointed. I let myself feel the loss of it, the grief for people who either never existed or died so gradually I didn't notice when they stopped being my family. The photos showed strangers wearing familiar faces. I closed the album and put it back on the shelf, accepting that whatever we had been was gone long before I came home from deployment. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I saw Detective Morris calling. I answered, and he got straight to the point without any greeting. He said even though I was cooperating and clearly the victim of their crimes, my own lie about being sick could create legal problems for me. The insurance company might come after me for fraud. The prosecutor might want to charge me with filing a false report if any medical claims got submitted. He couldn't promise complete immunity, and I needed to understand I might face consequences too. I told him I understood, and I was willing to accept that exposing them was worth whatever happened to me legally. He said okay, and reminded me that everything was set for this afternoon, that I should stay calm and let things play out. I hung up and checked the time. It was almost 1 in the afternoon. The doorbell rang and I heard Mom answer it. A delivery person asked her to sign for a certified letter. I walked into the hallway and watched Mom's face go white as she read the return address. She ripped open the envelope right there in the doorway, and I saw her hand start shaking as she read. The letter was from the insurance company formally notifying the family that my policy was under criminal investigation for fraud and all benefit access was frozen pending the outcome. Mom stumbled backward, and Dad came running from the kitchen asking what was wrong. She handed him the letter without speaking. His face went from confused to angry to scared in about 5 seconds. Cecilia came down the stairs asking what all the noise was about, and Pender followed behind her. Dad read the letter out loud in a voice that kept breaking. Criminal investigation, fraud, frozen benefits, possible prosecution. The words hung in the air like smoke. Then the explosion started. Dad turned on Mom and started screaming that this was her fault for pushing him to take out that loan, that he never would have done it if she hadn't kept talking about how much money we'd have. Mom screamed back that Cecilia was the one who kept making plans and spending money they didn't have yet, that she encouraged all of this. Cecilia started crying and yelling that Pender was the one who quit his job, that he was the one who kept saying I'd be dead soon anyway, so why wait? Pender got in Dad's face and said it was Dad who borrowed from dangerous people, who forged my signature, who got them into this mess. They went around and around, blaming each other, voices getting louder and meaner. I stood in the doorway watching them tear each other apart, and nobody even looked at me. They were so busy attacking each other they forgot I was there. The fighting went on for maybe 10 minutes before it started to slow down. Everyone was breathing hard and red in the face. Cecilia was crying for real now, not the fake tears she'd been doing for weeks. Mom had her head in her hands. Dad looked like he aged about 20 years. I heard myself say that maybe I could sell my car to help with some of the debts. The words just came out and I wasn't sure if I meant them or if I was still playing the game. For just a second, everyone's faces changed. They looked at me like I was actually their family member instead of a walking paycheck. Cecilia came over and hugged me tight, and for a moment she felt like my real sister, the one who used to braid my hair when I was little, and she was practicing for beauty school. But then Dad asked how much the car was worth. I said maybe $30,000. I watched him do the math in his head, calculating whether that was enough to cover what they owed. His face fell when he realized it wasn't even close. Mom asked if I had anything else to sell. Pender suggested I could cash out my military retirement early. The moment died as fast as it came, and they were back to seeing me as an asset to liquidate. I said I needed to go lie down before the hospice person arrived at 2. I told them I was feeling weak and needed to rest. They barely acknowledged me as I walked toward my room. I grabbed my keys and wallet from the dresser and slipped out the back door while they were still in the living room, arguing in lower voices. I drove across town to my penthouse and let myself in, making sure nobody followed me. I spent the next hour installing extra security locks on the door and windows. I set up my actual living space properly with my clothes in the closet and my personal items on the shelves. I made the bed with real sheets instead of the temporary setup I'd been using. This was my real home now, and I needed it to feel that way. Before I left, I grabbed a pill organizer from the bathroom and filled it with vitamins. I used a label maker to print out fake medication names that sounded like cancer drugs. I drove back to the family house and snuck the pill organizer into my room, leaving it on the nightstand where they'd see it. Let them think I was still taking my medication. Let them think everything was normal. Back at my penthouse, I opened my laptop and checked my secure email. Detective Morris had forwarded me a text message he'd intercepted from the loan shark's phone. It said Sunday, 2:30 p.m., bring cash or collateral. The timing collision was confirmed. The loan shark would be showing up right in the middle of the hospice meeting and the insurance audit. Detective Morris added a note at the bottom saying they'd have units ready to handle multiple situations at the same time, that I shouldn't worry about the dangerous people showing up because they'd be dealt with. I closed the laptop and felt my heart pounding. This was really happening. Everything was coming together in a few hours. I picked up my phone and called the hospice social worker. She answered on the second ring, and I told her my name and reminded her about the 2 o'clock appointment. I said I wanted to give her a heads up that the family meeting might be tense, that there were some financial problems adding stress to everything. She said she appreciated the warning and that she'd worked with families in crisis before. She said her job was to keep the conversation helpful and make sure everyone felt heard. I thanked her and hung up feeling slightly better knowing she was prepared. My phone rang again almost immediately. It was the insurance investigator calling to confirm her arrival time. She said she'd be at the house at 2:15 to conduct her audit interview with Dad, which meant she'd walk in right when the hospice meeting was starting. I told her that was fine and gave her the address again to make sure she had it right. She said she was looking forward to getting to the bottom of this situation and that fraud cases like this were taken very seriously by her company. I could hear the steel in her voice and I knew Dad was in for a rough time. She hung up and I sat there in my penthouse looking out the window at the city below. The convergence of official witnesses was coming together exactly as planned. Detective Morris and his team watching from outside. The hospice social worker asking questions. The insurance investigator conducting her audit. The loan shark showing up demanding payment. All of it happening at the same time in the same place with my family at the center. That evening, I set up my phone on a tripod and started recording a video. I looked at the camera and began talking, explaining everything from the beginning. I said I lied about being sick because I saw disappointment on their faces when I came home alive. I described overhearing them plan how to spend my death benefits. I talked about the loan Dad took out and the fake credentials Pender bragged about and the college degree Cecilia threw away. I explained about the coffee Mom tried to poison me with and the funeral they planned with the cheapest casket. I was honest about my own lies and manipulation, about how I fed into their plans and documented everything. I said I wasn't trying to paint myself as a perfect victim or some kind of hero. I admitted the moral complexity of what I'd done, how I'd deceived them even though they were trying to kill me. I talked about the gray areas and the questions I still had about whether I'd become as bad as they were. The video ran for almost 30 minutes and by the end my voice was rough and my eyes were burning. I stopped recording and saved the file to 3 different locations. If something went wrong tomorrow, if the loan shark's people hurt me, or if my family tried something desperate, at least there would be a record of the truth. I saved the video file to 3 different cloud accounts and locked my phone. My hands were still shaking from talking through everything out loud. I stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the city lights below. Tomorrow, at this time, it would all be over, one way or another. I went to my bedroom and pulled out a notebook, the kind with cheap lined paper that I used to use in high school. At the top of the first page, I wrote down the first question I wanted to ask. Something casual about their plans for after I was gone. I crossed it out because it sounded too obvious, like I was fishing for information. I tried again, making it sound more like a dying man wanting to know his family would be okay. I wrote down 5 different versions before I found one that felt natural. Then I moved on to questions about the money. How to bring up the loan without making it sound like I knew it was fraud. How to reference the insurance payout in ways that would get them talking. I filled 4 pages with different approaches, different phrasings, different ways to create openings for them to incriminate themselves. By the time I finished, it was almost midnight and my hand hurt from writing. I read through everything twice, memorizing the questions that felt most natural. Then I tore the pages out of the notebook and fed them through my paper shredder. I couldn't risk anyone finding my practice notes. I set 3 alarms on my phone for 6 a.m. and tried to sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios in my head. What if they realized it was a trap before the police arrived? What if the loan shark showed up early and things got violent? What if Mom had put something worse than sleeping pills in my coffee, and I'd actually been poisoned with something dangerous? My brain wouldn't shut off and I kept checking my phone every 20 minutes. Around 3 in the morning, I finally dozed off for a few hours. The first alarm went off at 6 and I woke up with my heart already racing. My hands were shaking, so bad I could barely hold my phone to turn off the alarm. I sat up in bed and felt like I couldn't get enough air into my lungs. My chest was tight, and my vision was getting fuzzy around the edges. I grabbed my phone and called Tristan with trembling fingers. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert even though it was early. I tried to tell him I couldn't do this, but the words came out in gasps. He told me to breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. I followed his instructions, and after a few minutes my vision cleared. He reminded me that I was doing this to protect myself, that my family had tried to poison me, that their choices created this situation. He said I was brave for standing up to them instead of just running away. He told me to take a shower and get dressed and call him back if I needed to. I thanked him and hung up. I sat on the edge of my bed for another 10 minutes, just breathing slowly. Then I got up and took the longest shower of my life, letting the hot water run over me until I felt almost normal again. At 9:30, I drove to a notary office on the other side of town. The woman behind the desk was in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain around her neck. I told her I needed to revoke some legal documents I'd signed. She pulled out the proper forms and asked me which documents I was revoking. I explained about the power of attorney papers my dad had me sign, the medical decision-making authority, all of it. She typed up the revocation paperwork and had me sign in 3 places while she watched. Then she stamped everything with her official seal and made certified copies. I asked for 5 copies and she ran them through her machine. I paid her in cash and she handed me the documents in a manila folder. I thanked her and walked out to my car. I sat in the parking lot and used my phone to scan all the documents, then emailed them to Detective Morris. Then I texted him that the originals were on their way. I drove to the post office and sent the folder by certified mail with signature required. Now there was a legal record that my family no longer had authority over my medical decisions or anything else. I got back to the family house at 11:45. My stomach was doing flips, but I walked through the front door like everything was normal. Mom was in the kitchen making lunch and asked if I wanted anything. I told her I wasn't hungry. Dad was in the living room watching television. Cecilia and Pender were upstairs. I went to my room and waited. At exactly noon, I heard a car pull up outside. I looked through the window and saw Detective Morris getting out of an unmarked sedan. He was wearing jeans and a polo shirt, looking like he could be anyone. I went to the front door and let him in before anyone else noticed. He followed me to my room and closed the door quietly. He pulled a small device out of his jacket pocket. It looked like a thick button with a wire attached. He had me take off my shirt, and he taped the microphone to my chest, running the wire down to a small transmitter that clipped to my belt. He showed me how to turn it on and off. Then he went over the safety rules. If I said the word hospital, they would come in right away. If things got physical, they were positioned outside and could be through the door in seconds. He told me to try to stay in the main living room where they had the best sight lines through the windows. He asked if I understood, and I nodded. He tested the microphone by having me count to 10 while he listened on his earpiece. Then he put his hand on my shoulder and told me I was doing the right thing. He left through the back door and I watched him walk casually down the alley to where his team was set up. At 1:30, I told my family that the hospice worker would be here at 2. Mom immediately started tidying up the living room. Dad changed into a nicer shirt. Cecilia came downstairs with red eyes like she'd been crying on purpose. Pender was wearing a tie which I'd never seen before. They were all playing their parts. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang and I answered it. Marguerite stood on the porch with a leather folder and a kind smile. She was maybe 50 with gray streaks in her dark hair. I introduced her to everyone and she shook hands with each family member. She sat down in the armchair and pulled out her intake forms. She started asking questions about my diagnosis, when I was diagnosed, what symptoms I was experiencing. I described the fake cancer symptoms I'd been performing. She asked about my care needs and my family jumped in, talking over each other about how devoted they were to helping me. Mom described the medication schedule she'd set up. Dad talked about taking time off work to be with me. Cecilia's voice broke as she talked about wanting to make my last months meaningful. I watched them lie smoothly to this woman's face and felt sick. Marguerite was writing everything down in her folder, nodding along, asking follow-up questions about pain management and mobility issues. The whole time I was thinking about the wire taped to my chest, recording every word. At 2:15, the doorbell rang again. Everyone's heads turned toward the door. I got up to answer it, and standing on the porch was a woman in a business suit holding a large folder. She introduced herself as Evelyn from the insurance company. I saw the color drain from Dad's face. I invited her in and explained that she was here to review some paperwork with Dad. The energy in the room changed completely. Mom's smile froze on her face. Cecilia grabbed Pender's hand. Marguerite looked confused but kept her professional expression. Evelyn sat down on the couch and opened her audit folder. She pulled out a stack of documents and looked at Dad. She said she needed to discuss some irregularities with his recent insurance transactions. Dad tried to act calm, but sweat was already forming on his forehead. His hands shook as he pulled out his own paperwork. Evelyn asked him to explain how he accessed my insurance portal. Dad started talking about how I was too sick to handle it myself, so he was helping me. His voice was shaking. Evelyn pointed to something on one of the forms and asked about the timestamps. She said the login record showed someone accessing the portal at 2 in the morning multiple times. Dad stumbled over his words, trying to explain. Then Cecilia suddenly blurted out that he had to do it because they needed the money, and I was dying anyway. The room went silent. Marguerite stopped writing and looked up sharply. Evelyn made a note on her form. Mom hissed at Cecilia to be quiet. Dad's face went red and he started explaining that it wasn't fraud because the money was going to come to them anyway. Evelyn asked him to clarify what he meant by that. Dad kept digging himself deeper, talking about the death benefit and how he just borrowed against it early. Pender had been drinking since morning and I could smell it from across the room. He suddenly laughed and said they'd all been so smart about this. He started listing everything they'd bought with the borrowed money. The new furniture, Cecilia's wedding dress, his truck down payment. He talked about quitting his job and how his boss had been too stupid to check his fake credentials anyway. He said they'd been planning this for months, just waiting for me to die so they could finally be rich. He described their plans for after I was gone like I wasn't sitting right there listening. Mom was trying to get him to shut up, but he kept talking. Cecilia was crying now, but not in the fake way from before. Real tears because she knew something was wrong. Pender kept going, talking about how they'd already spent the money in their heads, how they'd divided it up, how they'd even joked about ways to speed things along. Marguerite asked Mom about my medication management. Her voice was careful now, professional but cold. Mom got defensive immediately. She said she was just trying to help me rest. She said she'd been putting something in my coffee to help me sleep through the pain. She said it was just to make me comfortable. Marguerite's face went completely still. She wrote something on her form with very precise handwriting. She asked what specifically Mom had been putting in the coffee. Mom said just some sleeping pills, nothing dangerous. Marguerite asked how many pills and how often. Mom's voice got higher as she tried to explain that it was fine, that she was just being a good mother. Evelyn was writing everything down now, too. The whole room felt like it was holding its breath. The front door opened and Detective Morris walked in with 3 uniformed officers behind him. They moved with calm authority, spreading out into the room. One officer went to Dad. Another went to Mom. The third stood by Pender. Detective Morris identified himself and said they were separating everyone for questioning. Mom started crying and asking what was happening. Dad's face went gray. Cecilia looked at me, and I saw the exact moment she understood. Her eyes went wide and her mouth opened. She said my name like a question. Pender tried to stand up, but the officer put a hand on his shoulder. Detective Morris explained that they were investigating insurance fraud, identity theft, and attempted poisoning. He said everyone needed to come down to the station. Mom screamed that this was a mistake. Dad just sat there staring at nothing. Cecilia kept looking at me with this expression of complete shock. Then her face changed. The shock turned to anger, and then to something like hate. She realized I'd set this up, that I'd planned this whole thing, that the dying son they'd been celebrating was never actually sick. Pender started yelling about his rights. Mom was sobbing. Dad finally looked at me and I saw everything in his eyes. Confusion, fear, and underneath it all, the same disappointment I'd seen when I first came home from deployment. The officers moved Dad to the kitchen and Pender to the hallway while Mom stayed in the living room with a female officer standing next to her. Cecilia sat frozen on the couch, her face blank like she'd stopped processing what was happening. I stayed in my chair while Detective Morris explained that everyone would be questioned separately and transported to the station for formal statements. At exactly 2:30, the sound of tires on gravel made everyone's heads turn toward the front window. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, and 2 men in expensive suits got out, moving toward the house with the kind of walk that said they were used to people getting out of their way. The uniformed officers at the door intercepted them at the end of the driveway before they could reach the porch. I watched through the window as one officer asked for identification, and the taller man in the dark suit pulled out a wallet. The officer's posture changed immediately and he reached for his radio. Within seconds, the shorter man was turned around and handcuffed, while the taller one started arguing and pointing at the house. Detective Morris went outside and I could see him talking to the men, his hand resting casually on his belt near his weapon. The loan sharks my family owed money to were being arrested right there in front of the house, one of them apparently having an outstanding warrant that showed up when they ran his information. The dangerous creditor problem that had been hanging over everything was suddenly being handled by the legal system instead of threatening my family anymore. Mom started crying harder when she saw the men in handcuffs, probably realizing that her escape plan of using insurance money to pay off the debt was completely gone now. Over the next 2 hours, the house transformed into something that looked like a crime scene from a TV show. Evidence technicians arrived with cameras and collection kits, photographing everything and bagging items in clear plastic with labels and tags. They took the pill bottles from the kitchen counter, documenting each one with photos before sealing them. The coffee cup I'd saved with the grainy residue got special attention, carefully packaged with chain of custody forms that Detective Morris explained would track it all the way to the lab and back. They found my hidden recording devices, the pen and phone charger and clock that had been capturing conversations for days, and instead of being mad about it, the detective actually nodded approvingly and said it showed good thinking. The forged insurance documents that Dad had gotten me to sign were photographed in place and then collected as evidence of fraud. My fake medical records that I'd created to support the cancer lie were also taken, which made my stomach twist, because those proved I'd been lying too. Marguerite sat at the dining room table with an officer, giving her statement about what she'd witnessed during the intake meeting. She described Mom's admission about putting something in my coffee and how defensive she'd gotten when questioned about medication management. Evelyn was in Dad's home office with another officer, going through the computer and pointing out the fraudulent insurance portal access and forged documents she'd discovered during her audit. Both women had gone from being neutral professionals doing their jobs to being key witnesses in a criminal case, and I felt bad that my family drama had pulled them into this mess. Detective Morris drove me to the police station in his unmarked car while the evidence technicians finished processing the house. The station was busy with afternoon shift change, officers coming and going and people sitting in plastic chairs waiting to file reports or see someone in custody. He took me to a small interview room with a table and chairs and a camera mounted in the corner, the kind of room I'd seen in every cop show but never thought I'd actually be sitting in. I gave my full statement starting from the moment I came home from deployment and saw the disappointment on their faces. I explained the lie about having terminal cancer and how I'd watched them celebrate the news and start spending money they didn't have. I described the loan Dad took out against my life insurance and how Pender quit his job and Cecilia dropped out of school. I admitted to faking symptoms and stumbling into walls and coughing fake blood into tissues to make them believe I was getting sicker. I told him about the coffee that tasted wrong and the grainy residue I'd saved and how I'd heard them planning to speed things up. I explained setting up the Sunday meeting with the hospice worker and the insurance investigator as a trap to expose them with witnesses present. Detective Morris listened without interrupting, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates and times. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and told me I needed to get my own lawyer because even though I was clearly the victim of attempted poisoning and fraud, my own deception about being terminally ill could create legal complications. The insurance company might come after me for fraud too, or my family's lawyers might try to use my lie to make me look like the bad guy. He gave me the name of a defense attorney who handled complex cases and said to call him first thing Monday morning. By evening, the arrests started happening in waves as the investigation moved forward. Mom was booked on attempted poisoning charges, and the judge denied bail because the prosecutor argued she was a flight risk and potentially dangerous. She'd tried to kill her own son for insurance money, and the evidence of the drugged coffee plus her recorded statements made it a strong case. Dad got charged with insurance fraud and identity theft for the forged documents and illegal portal access, but he made bail with a bond that he somehow arranged through his brother. Cecilia and Pender were brought in for questioning about conspiracy. Both of them asked what they knew about the plans to speed up my death and whether they'd participated in any way. The text messages Cecilia had sent about finding ways to shorten the wait were shown to her during the interview. Pender's recorded statements about me being a dumb bastard who was about to make them rich were played back to him. Neither of them got arrested that night, but they were told not to leave town and to expect charges to be filed. Restraining orders were issued keeping all four of them away from me, with specific instructions that they couldn't contact me directly or through other people or even through social media. I was given copies of the protective orders, and Detective Morris explained that if any of them violated the terms, they'd be arrested immediately. Walking out of the police station that night, I felt strange and empty, like I'd been carrying something heavy for so long that now without it, I didn't know how to stand up straight. Over the next few days, my phone became unusable from all the calls and texts coming in from extended family members. Aunts and uncles and cousins I barely talked to were suddenly demanding to know what happened and why my parents were being arrested. Some of them had heard from Mom's side that I was a liar who faked cancer to set up my own family. Others had heard from Dad's brother that my parents were monsters who tried to kill me for money. Most of them were just confused and angry that private family business had turned into a criminal case with lawyers and courts involved. My phone buzzed constantly with messages asking for my side of the story, or telling me I was wrong, or saying they always knew something was off about our family. A few cousins sent supportive messages saying they believed me and asking if I needed anything. My dad's sister called me a manipulative psychopath who destroyed the family for attention. My mom's brother said he always knew my parents were capable of something like this. The family group chat that usually shared holiday photos and birthday wishes turned into a war zone of accusations and defenses and people taking sides. I stopped reading the messages after the first day because every notification made my chest tight and my hands shake. I turned off my phone and left it in a drawer, checking it once a day for messages from Detective Morris or my new lawyer, but ignoring everything else. The bail and arraignment hearings happened over the following week, and I had to attend some of them as a witness and victim. Dad made bail with money borrowed from his brother, walking out of the courthouse in the same clothes he'd been wearing when they arrested him. Mom's hearing was different because the prosecutor brought photos of the drugged coffee residue and played recordings of her talking about helping me rest through the pain. The judge looked at the evidence and listened to the prosecutor explain that Mom had access to medications and had already tried once to poison me. He denied bail and remanded her to custody pending trial, which meant she'd stay in jail until the case was resolved. Mom cried and her public defender argued that she wasn't a danger, but the judge said attempted murder of a family member showed a willingness to harm that made her too risky to release. Watching her be led away in handcuffs made me feel sick, even though I knew she'd literally tried to kill me. Cecilia's arraignment came a few days later, and she was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and conspiracy to commit assault. Pender got similar charges, plus his own fraud charges related to the fake credentials he'd bragged about. Both of them made bail and walked out looking smaller and older than they had a week ago. The judge issued protective orders preventing any of them from contacting me directly or through intermediaries, and warned them that violation would result in immediate arrest and bail revocation. The insurance company froze the entire policy and sent a letter saying all claims were suspended pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. My new lawyer met with their legal team to discuss my cooperation in the fraud case against Dad. They were willing to offer me limited immunity for my false statements about being terminally ill in exchange for my testimony about how Dad forged my signature and accessed my account illegally. The deal meant I wouldn't face criminal charges for lying about having cancer, but I'd have to pay back the $100,000 loan amount plus penalties and interest. My lawyer explained this was actually a good deal because technically I had committed fraud by making false statements to get sympathy, even though my family had used those statements to commit worse crimes. I'd have to pay back around $120,000 total over a payment plan, which would eat up a big chunk of my military bonus, but was better than going to jail. I signed the agreement and gave a detailed statement about everything I knew regarding the insurance fraud. The insurance investigator thanked me for my cooperation and said my testimony would be crucial in their case against Dad. 2 weeks after everything exploded, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. A man with a thick accent told me that my father still owed money and the debt didn't go away just because some of the collection people got arrested. He said I could help the family by paying what was owed, and when I said I wasn't paying anything, he told me I should think carefully about my decision. I recorded the call and sent it immediately to Detective Morris, who called me back within an hour. He said they were building a case against the entire lending operation, and these kinds of threats were actually helpful evidence. But in the meantime, the danger hadn't completely disappeared. He advised me to vary my routes and times, to be aware of my surroundings, and to call 911 immediately if I saw anything suspicious. I asked if I should get a gun, and he said that was my choice, but I should get proper training first if I did. The threat hung over me for days, making me check over my shoulder constantly and avoid going out after dark. I installed extra locks on my penthouse door and got a security camera for the hallway. Every unexpected sound made me jump, and every unknown car on my street made me nervous. I started moving my stuff fully into the penthouse, making it feel like an actual home instead of the secret hideout it had been. I bought real furniture instead of the minimal setup I'd had before, hung pictures on the walls, stocked the kitchen with actual food instead of just beer and takeout containers. I set up my military awards in the living room and put photos of my unit on the bookshelf, the guys who'd actually had my back when things got hard. The place slowly transformed from a crash pad into somewhere I could actually live, and working on it gave me something to focus on besides the legal case and the family drama. I found a therapist who specialized in family trauma and betrayal, a woman in her 50s who'd heard every terrible family story and didn't seem shocked by mine. In our first session, I sat on her couch trying to explain how I felt and kept coming back to the same thing, that I didn't know how to feel about any of this. Relief that I'd exposed them before they could actually kill me. Guilt that I'd lied and manipulated them even though they'd been planning worse. Anger at what they'd done and what they'd been willing to do. Grief for the family I'd thought I had, for the people I'd hoped they were but apparently never existed. All of it mixed together in ways I couldn't untangle, leaving me feeling numb some days and overwhelmed others. She told me that was completely normal, that trauma doesn't come in neat packages with clear emotions attached. She said we'd work on processing everything piece by piece, and that healing wasn't about making the feelings go away, but about learning to live with them, without being controlled by them. Tristan visited one weekend, and we sat on my balcony drinking beer and watching the city lights come on as the sun went down. For once, we didn't talk about the case or the family or any of it, just sat there like we used to do on base after long days. Eventually, I told him I kept having dreams where my family actually loved me, and the whole thing was a misunderstanding, where I'd wake up and they'd be happy I was alive instead of disappointed. He took a long drink of his beer and said that was normal, that wanting them to be different people didn't make me weak or stupid. He said everybody wants their family to love them. It's hardwired into humans, and just because they didn't doesn't mean something's wrong with me. He told me about his own dad who'd been a mean drunk, and how even now, years later, he sometimes caught himself hoping the old man had changed, even though he knew better. We sat there in comfortable silence, and I felt grateful that at least one person from my life had turned out to be exactly who I thought they were. The insurance company's legal team called 2 weeks later with their settlement offer. They wanted $40,000 paid back over 5 years, plus my full cooperation testifying against Dad in their fraud prosecution. My lawyer walked me through the terms over the phone, explaining that it wasn't perfect, but it was fair, given that I'd lied to them first about being terminally ill. He said taking the deal was smarter than risking criminal charges of my own, that judges don't like it when people file false insurance claims, even if they had good reasons. I signed the paperwork at his office the next morning, agreeing to monthly payments of $667 starting in 90 days. It felt like getting off easy considering everything that happened, and the lawyer said the insurance company just wanted their money back, and a prosecution witness more than they wanted to punish me. 3 months later, I'd settled into what passed for a new normal. Therapy happened twice a week with the trauma specialist, where we worked through trust issues and family dysfunction without trying to rush past the hard parts. Tristan called every Sunday to check in, sometimes just to talk about nothing, sometimes to make sure I was actually going to therapy and not isolating myself in the penthouse. I found a part-time job at a veterans support center, doing intake paperwork and resource coordination, something that got me out of the house and around people who understood deployment without needing explanations. The wire recorder Detective Morris gave me stayed in my desk drawer as a reminder that trust wasn't something you just gave away anymore. It was something you verified first and earned over time. I wasn't happy exactly, not the way people mean when they talk about happiness, but I was safe. Some days that felt like enough, like maybe safety was the foundation you built everything else on top of, and I was still learning how to lay those first stones without my hands shaking.